Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Rice University's Planet Now webinar series featuring current conversations in environmental studies. My name is Richard Johnson. I'm the Sustainability Director for Rice. I also co-direct the Environmental Studies program, which is overseen by Rice's Center for Environmental Studies. Our center and program are interdisciplinary in nature, and that is reflected in our joint home in the School of Architecture and the School of Humanities at Rice. I want to thank Deans John Kasparian and Kathleen Canning for their ongoing and unwaveringly enthusiastic support of our program. We are particularly grateful to the Humanities Research Center at Rice for helping to provide resources to help make the Planet Now webinar series possible through their Diluvial Houston grant from the Mellon Foundation. We have a wonderful staff in the School of Humanities who have assisted in making tonight's program possible. I want to be sure to recognize and to thank Eric Granquist, Tara Ousley, Dr. Sean Smith, Andrew Steffel, and John Waterhouse for their efforts. Thank you for those in mission control. Tonight, I am joined by two co-moderators. I'd first like to introduce the Director for the Center of Environmental Studies, Dr. Joseph Campana. Joe is a professor of English. He co-directs the Environmental Studies minor, and he's a poet, an arts writer, and a scholar of Renaissance literature. In its listing of his latest poetry collection, The Book of Life, Amazon.com declares, "Here is a poet who persists in the hope of reawakening the past." I would also like to introduce Dr. Simony Howe. Simony is a professor of anthropology, and her research focuses on the anthropogenic climate change and how it demands new ways of imagining our collective futures. She drew international attention in 2019 for helping to create a memorial for the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier due to climate change. And this effort was captured in a documentary that she co-created entitled Not Okay, a little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world. Joe and Simony are the best kinds of colleagues, collaborative, energetic, creative, supportive, generous with their time, and they really know how to get things done. So I am honored to work with them and to call them friends. Speaking of honors, Simony has the honor of introducing tonight's fabulous guest speaker. So at this time, I will yield the floor to her.
Thank you, Richard. That was a lovely introduction, and I am really excited to be introducing Jeff VanderMeer. As many of you know, Jeff VanderMeer is the author of many best-selling books, including the Southern Reach trilogy. The first book in that series, Annihilation, won the prestigious Nebula and Shirley Jackson Awards and was later adapted into a film directed by Alex Garland. With over a dozen novels and novellas, 4 volumes of short stories, and 2 books of nonfiction, VanderMeer is both prolific and at play with form, recently writing, for example, an op-ed from the future for the New York Times. With his wife, Anne VanderMeer, a Hugo Award winner herself, Jeff has also co-edited several award-winning anthologies, such as The New Weird and The Big Book of Science Fiction. Jeff's work has been compared to that of Thoreau, Melville, and Borges as it winds its way through multiple techno-wildernesses of the uncanny, bringing us into what one critic called the stranger forms of strangeness that live on the brambly margins of conventionalized narrative. As many of you here know, Jeff's work blooms with organic vitalities, attuning the relationships between people and place. And since we are here with you this evening in Houston, Texas, a place that is sometimes known as Petropolis, it is worth mentioning that the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico was an ecocidal event that further compelled Jeff's commitment to write through the mutative environmental worlds in which we currently find ourselves. In addition to having the title of the Weird Thoreau, Jeff has been described as, quote, one of the most forward-thinking authors of our decade. And given that particular distinction, we're especially thrilled that he is here to talk with us about speculative futures and to share his brand new work, Hummingbird Salamander. Please help me in welcoming Jeff VanderMeer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was waiting for the applause, which doesn't occur in this Zoom era. Thanks for that, and thanks also to everyone for being here. I was a little distracted for a moment there because in the ravine behind our house, I just saw an owl chasing a red-shouldered hawk, which is fairly unusual. Anyway, so excuse me. So Hummingbird Salamander, this new novel basically takes place in a continuum from our recent past to our present to about 10 seconds into our future, more or less. At least that's how I describe it. And the main character, Jane, is a security consultant who grew up in a dysfunctional family on a farm and who kind of came to terms with her childhood by becoming a high school and college wrestler. One day she receives a message from a dead woman named Sylvina, along with the key to a storage unit. And inside the storage unit, she finds a taxidermied hummingbird and a note suggesting that there's a salamander. And the salamander concerns her too, or perhaps is what pulls her in along with what she's found, because she has a personal connection to salamanders because of events that happened back in the farm. But she doesn't know Sylvina, and she doesn't know why Sylvina has chosen to give her this message for the hummingbird. Worse, Sylvina is known as a fugitive who may or may not be an eco-terrorist, depending on maybe what your definition of that is in the modern era. And that she's also founded a kind of bizarre environmental commune called Unitopia. So, you know, Jane is already kind of restless with her life when this comes into her life, and she quickly goes down a rabbit hole of investigating this taxidermy and what this might mean coming from Sylvina. And early on, she attends a security conference in New York as she's deciding what to do, and she kind of uses some of her contacts there to gather information. So I'm going to read part of the New York section, which gives a sense, I think, given the title of this series, of how the novel exists in both our present and our future. And then end with a scene where Jane is kind of encountering a section from Sylvina's journal, which Jane eventually finds, that kind of leads her further into the mystery and emotionally involves her in such a way that she doesn't feel like she can get free. So here we go. I have really not read from this before, so you're getting it fresh. The conference had a small, tight feel, insular, familiar logistics, the jokes familiar, the words disruptor and drone meaningless, the first from repetition, the second through transformation and camouflage. The hauntings we could rationalize become full-throated here, conjured up by panel titles on subjects that might be obsolete or irrelevant soon. Smartphone virus displacement and reporting tools, home security exfiltration tactics and totalitarian regime change, future opportunity in zoonotic viruses sector, wireless trail cam lamprey remote access. This treadmill that kept changing under our feet, growing fangs and spikes, even as it paid the bills. Year 30 in the same once glamorous hotel in the once glamorous country, the lobby out of date and cheerless, modernized with its unique boutique scent. Little in New York felt glamorous anymore. An eruption of the real had overtaken the unreal. Wildfires had consumed states in the heartland, cyclones another, earthquakes from fracking were omnipresent, oil spills from pipelines that didn't bear thinking about, pandemic, a rumor gathering strength, speculation, snippets in the corridor as I oriented myself to location. Ice caps equal an opportunity for resource extraction. You can't count on fossil fuels forever, so plastics. What I would do is invest in waterproof equipment. Stench of gasoline followed us up into the conference rooms, stitching launch of drones outside delivering packages. The organizers had decided to make it a masquerade party. We were all to wear masks supplied by companies that made designer versions. Others mimicked quarantine masks, but were specific to the sub-industry that subverted facial recognition software. Peacock iridescent, some with feathers, others as soulless as VR tech, a few with miniature waterfalls running down the cheekbones. Soon companies would be able to produce masks that were living creatures or a hologram of what looked like a localized dystopia for your face. I chose a plain, neutral surgical mask. The walls of the main ballroom had been fitted with banal neon catchphrases. A bird had gotten trapped there, sight of the opening remarks, but we all took video, thinking it might be some new product instead. Later, I listened to the last speaker of the day and wondered if we should give up and let the torrent overwhelm us. That we were managing quality of life for patients with a long-term low fever virus. I said all of that to someone in the hallway after a panel. They ignored me. I wasn't on panels myself because I had registered late. Still working for that piece of shit company, a voice said. I turned and there was a man from a direct rival. Colorful shirts, broad collars, former tech bro chastened by a bankruptcy. He'd never be a CEO again until he was. Yes, I'm still working for that piece of shit company, I said in a monotone. Well, if you ever want to work for a real company, I'll eat you and use your bones for soup, I said. I gave him my best wrestling snarl and then licked my lips. He looked confused, maybe even frightened, turned away. At the same time, I turned away, only to fall into another unwanted conversation. Do you fake it to make it? An older gentleman said to me, staring up from eyes and a bald head that topped out around 5'3". He, like me, could remember the idea of the Commodore 64 and floppy disks, but unlike me, he might remember punch cards too. Everything I do is real, I said, peering down at him. I'll bet, he said, but does it matter? Dark web, I said as a joke, dark web, just because I could, just because we use the term so much to scare civilians. He nodded like he knew what I meant, like a meaning lay below the dark web, like anything I said would be prophetic. But he made me feel like an eclipse, so I made an excuse to pivot to the refreshments table. Fake it to make it. With distance, I can see that the problem had a larger scope and that eventually I'd bought into systems that despised me. We were assholes and opportunists and sociopaths, a lot of us. We thought we were on the right side of things, but what did it mean that our clients resembled ghouls and grave robbers? The system was fixed, and I helped to fix it. What I believed was bulwark or siege defense morphed into the predatory. Systems flourished without consideration of people. Efficiency, and especially the word proactive, lived in our heads always. Another was optimization. Most of the rest are fuzzy or pulled one by one from my mind like hooks from the mouths of a row of fish, until I'm floating in the dark water, released but wounded, floating to the bottom, light lost in the murk above. But I'd rather live here. It's more secure, for one thing. For another, I can't hurt anyone here from afar. What is need but a perversion in the end? I did receive the damage too, but mostly it streamed out from me. The blessing now is Sylvina shining out from my eyes, obliterating the past. So she continues to investigate, and she comes into contact with what she thinks is maybe a covert government agency, and also the very rich and powerful enforcers for the family that Sylvina came from. And along the way, she manages to find Sylvina's journal. And maybe Sylvina wanted her to have it, she's not sure. She's still searching for the hummingbird when she starts to read it. Much of Sylvina's, searching for the salamander. Much of Sylvina's journey described an epic journey down the West Coast. This was in the third year of her banishment after the trial. I would have been 33 at the time, oblivious, still learning the ropes of the company, not yet a manager. I reread the story of her expedition over and over, not just because it had been important to her, but because it was odd to see the familiar through her eyes and to realize how familiar it had been to her, that Argentina had meant little to her, and after her trial, even less. For the first time on the West Coast, I felt in a way as if I was home, Sylvina wrote. In those endless miles of coast, in the cold and the fog and the rain, I opened up what was closed down. I received and kept receiving. It was sunless. Bridges would appear monstrous out of endless shadow. The smell of marsh water would hit unexpected, and the richness of cedar. I would drive until I found a wilderness trail through hills or along the coast. I loved lighthouses because they were always somewhere isolated. I didn't like to see lots of people when driving. How can we pretend we're alone? But I wanted to pretend I was alone until I wasn't. I saw deer and otters, a bobcat or two, and once a bear in the distance, just a smudge shadow. While in the trees as I walked, so many birds, and under rocks and fallen branches, a world of the small that carried on beneath our notice. I did fall in with strangers sometimes. I could tell by the look in someone's eye when they said hello, whether they approved or disapproved of me. But I spent time with the disapprovers as much as the other because I was curious. And sometimes around a campfire, they would soften. Others never lose a rigid, guarded pose, and I would make excuses soon enough. Sylvina would stay in cheap motels and befriend people in bars and diners. Once she stayed in a houseboat along a river delta for a month or two. A few times the folks she befriended in bars she would go home with. She described them as above with a miraculous miscomprehension, as if they were miracles, because most of the time she was out in the wilderness, as if over time she didn't know what a human really was. I wasn't searching for anything, she wrote, and yet still I found it. I found a place to work and to live and to be at peace, a place to sever myself from the past and not to seek it out anymore. If I could only exist in the present, then my problems would be gone, or would only ever be in front of me. I saw the naiad hummingbird at elevation in the middle of the King Range, and I don't think anyone was within 100 miles. This was the off-season, cold and blustery, and I wasn't really prepared, so I felt the chill too much and lost weight, but I was happy. The more my body reduced itself, the more my mind seemed to expand, the more I could experience what was around me. I did not bathe, I did not shower. I walked until I was tired and then tried to sleep inside my sleeping bag inside a tent. The food tasted like nothing to me. By the 10th day, animals did not appear to see me. I could walk by a deer and it wouldn't run. The otters by the creek gave me a first and a second look, then continued with their day, or so it seemed to me. Yes, she writes, on the 12th day I saw the hummingbird, coming across it with the overwhelming scent of a mountainside rich green with moss and lichen, and the trees full of lichen too, and ferns so their leafless limbs burgeoned with life. I turned a bend to see a puddle or a pond, something caused by rainwater in the middle of the trail, and bent down over the water to drink. I saw the hummingbird. A female, the iridescent black wings, her sharp, long, thin beak. She didn't see me at first, her back to me, and I stood and watched as she stood there defenseless on the ground, drinking, until with a little cry she sensed me and alarmed rose effortless and acrobatic straight up into the air and cursed me from above, hidden soon by the trees. I hadn't eaten all day. I had drunk very little water. I felt light as air, and in the moment of seeing the hummingbird, I began to weep with the beauty of it, which I cannot convey. I cannot get across to you or anyone the emotion of that moment, because of the hummingbird on the ground, not in flight, and knowing that not one person in a million had experienced the miracle of such a small moment. So you can imagine how I felt when later I identified the bird and realized how rare the species was and headed towards extinction, and what I had borne witness to wasn't just a minor miracle, but in fact a moment that would replicate only another 100 or another 1,000 times. That in the history of the world, a naiad hummingbird would only come to the ground to drink a finite number of times before they no longer existed. This thought was unconscionable to me, unbearable. It ripped me in two, it destroyed me, and then it remade me, and I became someone different than before. Just reading Sylvina's account on the page destroyed me, remade Jane. I was already in the grip of such exhausting emotions and impulses, yet I let Sylvina in again when I had resolved not to, because I had let the hummingbird in first. Thank you.
Beautiful work, Jeff. Thank you.
Oh,
and
sure.
what a treat to get to be the fresh ears for hearing
Yes,
it.
to be experimented on.
Yeah, that's okay. This is the kind of experimentation that we can embrace, I think. I'm all in. I love this, the world of the small and the small moments and the kind of intensity of the hummingbird, who's this like highly metabolic creature, right? But so tiny in their perfection. And this description of when the hummingbird arrives, you could almost like feel that particular wind that a hummingbird makes when they get really near your face, and you can actually feel the flutter of their wings and that kind of intense buzz that they make. It's astounding. So really wonderful stuff. I had a kind of bigger question that has to do with your work in general and the form that it takes. And your work is pretty famously not classifiable, kind of not beyond description, but beyond classification or outside of classification. It's not really science fiction, although it's weird in the best way. It's been described as speculative fiction in some cases, or climate fiction, maybe. It's got these utopian, dystopian qualities. It's got uncanny qualities through and through. And you've said that sometimes you are writing about what it's like to encounter something that's beyond human comprehension. And so I wanted to ask you, like, how does writing in this kind of miasmatic form allow us to work through or see things or feel things or understand things about the climate catastrophe that are otherwise unimaginable?
Well, I mean, there is in part the one very basic thing, which is that a large number of us are disconnected from nature in some way, or disconnected from, the world beyond the human, however you want to describe it. And I think that reminding ourselves of just how miraculous and complex that world is extremely important. I would say that personally, my life has been formed and influenced by those kinds of moments too, to the point where it feels personal to write in that way. But I think that there's also just the issue of this is kind of what it's like to be human. I think is that we go through life, having to kind of like block things out that are miraculous all around us in very simple processes and in our day, and every once in a while we're reminded, we're awakened to the fact that we've blocked all this stuff out. And I think that, I keep going back to this again in my work about the idea of a useful contamination, and the idea of removing some of the distance between nature and culture that's become kind of an unnatural burden between the two, and is kind of allowing us to, for example, de-link green energy from conservation of habitat, even though that is a kind of green tech as well. And so, this is incredibly important right now when we're seeing that green tech is becoming more and more extractive, that we're having issues with regard to lithium mining, we're having issues with regard to indigenous rights, with regard to lithium mining and other things that are connected to green technologies, the very things that are supposed to bring us out of this. But the problem is that we seem to be bringing the same philosophies and mindset along with that came from fossil fuels and the approach that we've had to energy and to society in general. And so I think this is a very important area where we're delinking things that need to be connected.
I'll just ask you a quick follow-up too, because I think it's related, and that is the sort of emotional register that I find across your work, really. And as I've been, talking with students in my class, we talked about the humor and the joy that pops up in these contexts. And I'd love to hear you talk about how you see humor functioning, how it works, and how it might help us to expand the emotional bandwidth in different ways, because so much of this discussion about renewable technologies, there's some hope and utopianness involved in that, but there's also quite a bit of dread and terror and helplessness that's tied up into the climate crisis, right? And most of what we read about it is in that that zone. But I think you bring humor and joy in different ways, and I'd love to hear you talk about that emotional side of your writing too.
Well, I mean, there is still a lot of joy and a lot of amazing things to experience in the world that are to some extent pure, even though they're dwindling in terms of the more granularity you get to your knowledge, the less you can enjoy things unadulterated without footnotes and whatnot. But the thing about humor is that a big component of humor for me is absurdism. And absurdism is really, for me, about charting the irrationality of the human mind, which I think is another important thing to talk about with regard to climate crisis, which is already, as we famously has been said 1,000 times, a kind of derangement and a kind of a unevenly distributed thing that's hard for the human mind to capture. So absurdity really helps to lay bare that element and to make us hopefully be more self-aware of our illogic to get to solutions that actually make sense and actually are logical. But then there is the actual humor itself, which in a book like Born, takes place in the conversations between a mother and a very strange plant child, so to speak, but which serve this really important purpose, which is to show, first of all, that even in extreme situations, humans still have the full range of emotions and experiences and may engage in very dark humor as a coping mechanism. In Hummingbird Salamander, it's a little bit more attuned to people who read a lot of noir and thrillers to see the humor, because there's quite a few phrases and whatnot in there that are riffing off of classic noir. There's some pithiness that's meant to be both serious and also kind of be amusing. And there's situations that Jane finds herself in that, again, go back to this irrationality. I mean, I purposefully, I think some of the conversations like an Annihilation and Authority are pretty hilarious when you really break down what's being said. And that's because people often talk past each other or talk across purposes. And in Hummingbird Salamander, that happens a fair amount where people may not even really be truly conversing with one another. They're looking at something else. And I think this is important to recognize too when we're talking about how we even talk about the climate crisis.
Richard?
Yeah, and so I just as a note for our viewers, if you'd like to put a question in the Q&A, we will keep our eyes on it, and we may be pulling some questions from there in a few minutes. So let us know what's on your mind. What's on my mind is that futurists use the term wildcards to describe these low probability events that have a really high impact when they occur, and they unfold very quickly. So, they change our view of the world. So 9/11, for those of us in the US, was a wild card event. Certainly COVID was a wild card event for just about everybody on the planet. So as you construct futures in your work, how do you go about creating wild cards or building worlds based on one or several wild cards having already happened?
Well, that's a good question. The thing of it is that everything I write comes specifically out of the character, to the point where any kind of world building is kind of subsumed in that. And I don't really think in terms of wildcards. And I think that that's really important to make as a distinction, that the actual terminology, it's not that I disagree with you, it's that because I don't use that terminology, I feel like I'm speaking a different language and trying to answer your question. And I think it's that way for a lot of writers, is that if you come from a total different vernacular in how you think about it or how you internalize it in your body almost, so Jane, in a weird way is sheltered from what you call the wild cards that are occurring in her world. But the reader is not, which is to say that there's a period where she is extremely isolated and kind of on the run, but the world is still falling down around her, but she has this other thing she has to focus on. But the reader, at least the feedback I've gotten so far, is focusing on those things in the background. And so in addition to the paranoia and the intenseness of what Jane is actually investigating, the reader is getting this continual uptick of tension in the backdrop from the things that Jane is not experiencing directly, but that we have already experienced in the last year. And so that for me was the key thing, is that even if Jane isn't experiencing some of those things directly, that some of that stuff is in there, not to make it topical, but to make it real to the present and the future. And that was about distance. That was really about, you know, if I get too close to some of those things, then I become too topical in a way that makes the novel dated like in a year. And it's not that I don't mind necessarily writing a novel that becomes dated right away, but that's not what I felt Hummingbird Salamander's scope really was, especially, and it makes more sense when you read the ending, but which I don't want to give away. But I didn't want that stuff in there. And so I guess to answer your question is that sometimes it's about the distance you have from it, and you let the reader fill in from their own experience those moments, and they're having their own little sparks as the character's going along.
Thank you. Joe?
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was a wonderful reading. Also so hauntingly right now, which is just sort of interestingly in tension to the question I want to ask. I mean, though I first want to say, and it concerns how we think about the future and what the utility of thinking about the future is, right? And I say that in the context not just of your work, but also, of course, your work, but also that my great colleagues here are teaching wonderful courses in our curriculum. We plan these series, and this series kind of relative to the curriculum. So Richard is teaching a wonderful new course, ENS 210. Shout out to ENS 210, Sustainable Futures, and Simony right now, ENS in Anthropology 391, which I think I'm getting right, Speculative Futures, right? I was just talking with grad students using an artist system called Investing in Futures, Marina Zircon, Sarah Rothberg, to think about parameters for thinking futures. But the hauntingly now of your reading made me also think about how there's a real dilemma, right? For some, we've spent too little time thinking about the future. That's some of how we got ourselves to where we are. And on the other hand, others who think of future thinking as drawing us out of the now, perhaps into too easily utopian or dystopian, right, trains of thought. So I just wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, given how much in your work you reflect on this question, that sort of usefulness of speculation and thinking futures, and its tension with being absolutely right now, which is where your reading was with that hummingbird.
Well, I think the value of a novel is it can be kind of a laboratory for things that don't happen, or you don't want to happen, or you don't want to experiment with in real life. And so that might be part of the answer, is that a novel is not trying to give an answer. It is trying to create a context in which elements can be put in play in such a way that an answer may occur, or perhaps the anti-answer may occur. And, this novel takes the form of a thriller, but, I deliberately made some things complex. Like Silvina has some big ideas about the future and what sustainability might mean. But she also comes with some constraints. I mean, she is this radical. At the same time, she comes from a very wealthy family. And there may be some constraint about her view of the future based on the fact that she has that upbringing. Jane, meanwhile, has no conception of an environmental future. It's not something that has really been on her mind until it's awakened in her by Silvina's gift, so to speak. I guess my answer is that each novel has to have, I think, a certain amount of granularity. Too little and it's not relevant or useful in the way you're talking about. Too much, which is to say to be too thorough. And I would argue, as much as people like it, that Kim Stanley Robinson's latest novel falls into this category as a novel, okay, not necessarily as a think experiment. And something else happens. So, I think that what you're talking about is extremely valuable. and it works both ways, but it's hard for me as a novelist to kind of answer your question directly, which is why I keep sliding away from it. But I would say, just as an aside, that one of the last times I was there in Houston and we had a dinner or something, I had a conversation that actually, with many of you, that sparked the next novel I'm working on, Drone Love. And it actually tries to grapple with, what happens when maybe an ocean or a lake is completely plastic? Do things adapt to that? How do you adapt to those situations? What does biotech really mean? That op-ed that we were talking about in the thing was also inspired by that talking to y'all. So I think that definitely there's a conversation that occurs and it gets translated into something that's maybe useful, but not as recognizable as what you would imagine.
Well, no, I love too the way that your answer actually comes back to the importance of the form that you're writing in, right? And so, as a poet myself, I think a lot about that. What is it that sort of literature adds, and what can literary devices, literary ways of thinking add to the conversations we have? But also this sense of contamination, right? That there could be a useful, interesting, useful, beneficial version. We know about of the ones that are not, but especially with respect to time. I just came off of reading Dead Astronauts, where I think, oh my God, am I also a dead astronaut? Are we all? I mean, that even though it's very in the future in a certain way, it's also very hauntingly now, or that it's so contaminated you wouldn't be able to tell the one for the other. And again, I think that's a fascinating feature of the way that you work in literary form.
Well, I think what I want to do is I want to make the reader feel it in their body. And if I can make the reader feel in their body something that's a really alien state, then maybe they can really understand it. And sometimes I feel like there's things that we need to understand that feel alien, that if we could only make them familiar, would make it a lot easier for us to negotiate what we're negotiating. And I'm not trying to harp on the latest novel, but I really would be quite fascinated, if anyone would be willing to to flatter me with this, is a year from now, debate the end of it and what it means, and what the complexity is there, and what's the usefulness or not usefulness of it, because I don't intend for it to be unambiguous. But it's hard to go into right now since the novel isn't even out.
Let's pencil that on the calendar.
I was just going to say that, Joe. Let's put it on the calendar.
But anyway, back to you, Simony.
Jeff, we have a question from a viewer, and I think you can see it, but the other viewers can't, so I'll just read it out loud.
Okay.
From Vittoria, who says, I am very drawn to the close associations with surrealism in your work, and I would absolutely love to hear ideas you might have about the relationship between surrealism, speculative evolutionary views, and the future and invented ecologies. There you go.
That's a great question. I feel like I could write an essay about that question, and now I'm feeling like my answer is going to be inadequate. But I think that some of the surrealist ways of pushing through the imagination to try to get somewhere different, or to get beyond kind of like a usual logic in text or art, is really valuable to me. I even used decalcomania, the idea of an uneven surface that they would paint on, paint across just one color, and then they would see what shapes suggest, and then they would pull those out. That's sometimes how I write, depending on how I'm approaching a rough draft. But I think it's the same thing I was going back to, which is that anything that can dislocate the reader and then relocate them somewhere else in a useful way. And the other thing about surrealism that I like is often it's the use of very precise description and language. We think of it as this amorphous, floaty thing, but to get to that surreal effect, it often requires extremely tight detail and close observation. And that is what ties it to the real and to the world we live in, even if the actual effect and where it goes to is somewhere completely different. But I could, like I said, try to write an essay about that. Maybe badly, I don't know, but good question.
It's your next prompt for the next op-ed and the next novel. I know that you and Anne are really avid rewilders, and that you're doing a lot of rewilding in this ravine behind your house, and that there is a trail cam there. And I think that there's a story to be told about someone called the traitor Jesse Bunn. And this is also a prop that was like a prop to ask you, what's going on with all the animals and the creaturely subjects, the creaturely figures in so much of your work? You have a lot of them. You have mutant ones, you have evolving ones, you have de-evolving ones, you have cyborgic, techno-manipulated ones. So what do these creatures do for the stories you're telling? Or what can animals tell us about the future?
Well, I think that if you study, I do try to study the science of animal behavior. And I do try to have a sense of what an animal's quote unquote perspective is before I write about it. Usually there's some kind of distortion, human distortion of that animal, like the blue fox has been experimented on in Dead Astronauts, because it's, as I've said in the past, if I were to write from purely a fox's point of view, it would just be 500 pages of smells, because that's how foxes see the world. And then you would have to interpret what that actually means. You wouldn't be able to. So I have to, as the writer, have some kind of rationale or filter often that is human. And in this case, it's that the fox has been altered to be slightly more human. But at the same time, I still think I can convey a foxness. And I can also do this thing that a fox is a very well-known cultural character, right? So I can also play off of all the different ways in which human cultures have interacted with foxes. And that brings in an element of communication. And so they are the things we think of when we think of a habitat. It's very important for me with the ravine to attach, without hopefully sentimentality or unuseful anthropomorphism, animals to, including the squirrel that's running up the branch there, to what I'm doing here, what we're doing here, because that's how people think of the environment. And if it's empty of those things, and you just talk about the plants, people tend not to be as emotionally involved. Now, the trail cams have been extremely useful because I can distinguish each of the 8 different raccoons that pass through the ravine. I have a good idea of their personalities. I have a good idea of some of the possums' personalities. There's a couple of possums that look like they're about to push one of the raccoons into the bird bath. That's the kind of possum they are. And not every creature allows you to see it in that way. I still don't know what the armadillo is thinking, but I certainly know that there's one raccoon that likes to play with the tennis ball that's down in the ravine, and the others don't. So when you can see that, at least you can create a characterization that I think is useful, especially because there's another thing going on that I'm trying to push back against in the fiction and in the rewilding, and that is the propaganda that is out there. So you have propaganda from pest control companies. If you Google most common urban animals now, the first thing that come up are pages from pest control companies, not actual facts. So if you Google flying squirrels, most likely what you'll see is that if you hear a flying squirrel, you have an infestation and you need to kill them. And a flying squirrel, is not even a nuisance as long as it's not in your attic. It's actually a very useful thing in the environment. So very, very harmless animals get demonized. And so part of what I'm trying to do with the rewilding and how I talk about it is undemonize these animals. And raccoons get a bad rap too. I would admit that in our ravine, we're very lucky in that the way they interact, they're not in any way, habituated to any humans. They don't try to go after the garbage cans. They're very wild and they're very afraid of humans. So it may be a slightly different experience than, say, someone who lives in Toronto. I don't know.
Cool. Richard?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask what's basically kind of a follow-up to this. It seems like we're constantly hearing stories about how animals and even plants are more intelligent than we had thought. And there was an item that came out the other day that someone had at Cambridge had done a version of the marshmallow test for cuttlefish, and the cuttlefish passed it. And this is the test where it's about delayed gratification and actually sort of thinking about the future and making a choice related to that. And so I wanted to get your thoughts about if you sort of project this idea even forward, that we're going to continue to find that the animals are more intelligent than we thought, that the plants are more intelligent than we thought. We know that trees have some ways to communicate with each other. What does this suggest about our own future and how we act?
Well, this is my continuing thesis, is that it's like we have landed on an alien planet and we are unable to tell what the intelligent life forms are because they're so alien to us. But the twist is it's Earth, and we can't find the imagination or whatever it takes to not only recognize that. I mean, we're recognizing it in these science papers, but then how does that affect policy? That's really what it comes down to. What's the route which that gets to a policy that leads to better behavior towards animals, better laws about animals, which in turn, I think, affects how we view habitats and what we do with habitats or don't do. I mean, for example, in Florida right now, the amount of destruction of wilderness is absolutely horrific. And that means box turtles bulldozed over. If you lose a mature pine tree, you lose all these organisms. They don't go somewhere else, they die. Because somewhere else already has a population of those organisms. And so, someone will move into a subdivision that's just been built in Florida, and they'll have no recognition, and I don't expect them to, but the people who actually did the work clearly saw the destruction was going on. It's kind of a hidden apocalypse that's going on at the development level. And it's not about overpopulation, it's about bad planning. It's about not having the right regulation. And so those are the kinds of things that I think about when you ask that question, which is that how do we get to a point where we value a box turtle to the point where we do the thing that's right for us and them, that we don't just keep destroying stuff. And we have an absolute disaster going on at Indian River Lagoon right now. 450 manatees this year have starved to death because the seagrasses are gone because of the amount of pollutants being poured into that body of water. Well, that's also affecting every other organism there, and it's affecting humans all along the way. It's just that we don't drop dead immediately the way a salamander does when its skin gets perforated by a poison. That's the other part of the component is making something invisible visible, but then also what you're talking about, which is making visible the fact that we live among all these amazing organisms that are more complex, whether you call it intelligence or anything else, than what we've realized.
I think I'd love to follow up in a way, though I'm also now just dwelling on those manatees and thinking about.
Yeah, sorry. I mean,
no, it's important. I mean, that incredible Anne Waldman poem, Humanity, Manatee, where she's, I think, trying again too to kind of contaminate these separations that allow us to behave in ways where that becomes not just foreseeable, but likely, right? It's not just probable, but almost certain. But I'm thinking about that kind of rapturous moment of with the hummingbird that you just read. So, but instead of asking some other questions, I want to ask one from the room, which I think is related, and it's from a grad student here at Rice, who I'm fortunate to work with at ENST 500 this semester, Timothy Grieve Carlson, and I'll read it and then I'll populate it in the room so everyone can see it. From the nature worship of Algernon Blackwood to the ecstatic atheism of H.P. Lovecraft, authors of weird fiction have consistently embedded their religious worldviews into the cosmologies they build in fiction. You made a few references to a disbanded paranormal research group in Area X in your novel Authority. Does religion or paranormal belief play a part in your writing at all? How do you feel about religious interpretations of your work?
Well, I mean, first of all, I deliberately made sure that the one very religious person in Acceptance was a decent human being, because although I have some issues with organized religion, I think it's really important that when you portray religion in these contexts, that you do it in a complex way and you do it in the right way. So I am, I guess you might call, agnostic atheist. I don't need a God. I just need to recognize the complexity of the world around us, and that gives me kind of a spiritual feeling. And I don't know that it's necessarily nature. It's just simply an awe at the complexity and the beauty of the world around us. in general, and of people. I have so many non-human characters that sometimes people don't realize I have a lot of human characters too. So I deal with it sometimes, and sometimes I will skewer organized religion because it's like any other human institution that's full of absurdity. It doesn't otherwise really come into play. But, I feel like there's novelists out there, like maybe Michael Faber, is that his name, who has dealt with that subject in a science fictional way, in an interesting way. It also has to do with climate change.
I'll read, I think I'll read another question here from the audience to Jeff. It's hard to choose which one, but I'll pick this one. From Bren Round says, I notice your work frequently involves characters reading documents or narratives by other characters. Yeah, that's a good observation. How do you conceive of this archival textually or nestedness? And how does it have, or does it have, ecological valences?
I don't know. I don't know if it's just a quirk I have, because I have noticed it myself at the same time that I've also noticed that there's always some window into another world, whether it's figurative or literal in most of my work. And yet all the work is very different. So, I don't know. I mean, I find it useful in terms of how the past speaks to the present, maybe in some ways, I mean, I also, for the first time in Hummingbird Salamander, have actual texts and emails in large quantity, even though I kind of, just like you do with conversation, I kind of, I don't reproduce them faithfully, right? I do them in kind of a stylized way because it's more readable. I don't know the answer to that question. It's one of those things that I haven't analyzed too closely, because since it's integral to a lot of the work, I'm afraid of some things I like to analyze. Some things, if I analyze them too much, I feel like that'll somehow affect the work negatively. So
I wanted to also bring up the fact that your work has gotten recently, in the last several years, a lot of recognition in the popular domain, if you want to call it that, being made into films and TV shows and getting optioned in that way, and best-selling books. And I wanted to ask you, and this is sort of a weird question, and maybe there's no answer to it, but how do you write things that people want to read that are, there's a certain disturbing element to your work, that kind of uncanny and that discomfort that you feel after finishing, I think, a lot of your stories, and yet there's a utopian, beautiful side. But how do you write the work that people want to read?
I think I do it mostly by not necessarily thinking about that in a specific way. I always write the thing that I want to read and I'm most passionate about, but I am very aware, more than I was as a very young writer, of where to leave space for the reader. And I think in some of my early work, I didn't do that because I misunderstood what that meant. Like, to me, early on, that meant that I was like selling out or becoming too commercial if I left space for the reader. I'm not sure I even really understood the term. And now I do understand. I understand that, there are moments, like I was talking about how the world around Hummingbird Salamander, around Jane, impacts the reader more than it does Jane sometimes. That's something the reader is kind of filling in at times from what's happened in the last year. And there's other times where I really do want the reader to be doing half the work, and not lead them too much, but also not mystify them too much. But the thing of it is I think that I have a real compassion. I try to have a compassion and understanding of every character I write about, and I try to have characters that care passionately about something. They may be really flawed, they may be really fucked up, but they, there's something there that makes you want to follow them. And I think that the purest part of that is probably Born, and that's partly because Rachel is the most unambiguous character I've probably written, in terms of being just somebody that just is a nice person, who's trying to survive, basically, despite everything that happens. But I think there's some value too in a character who does things that are not so nice all the time, and you want to understand why. And I think for for some people, the biologist in Annihilation is that person. For some people, the biologist is perfectly nice as she is, but there's a spectrum in terms of how you interact with them. But I don't know the answer. I feel incredibly lucky that I have a readership at all, and that people engage with the books. I mean, I got the most amazing email about Born the other day about how the therapy, the damage in Born and the recovery from damage that Rachel has was therapeutic in some way, and that's something I would never have expected. And I don't even know really what to do with that, but it was a humbling moment.
That's great. That's really interesting. We had a nice discussion in our class about whether one would want a Born in their life or not. I was full on. Sure. I want one. I want one, but I might have been the only one.
No, I'm with you, Simony. I want one too.
Okay. As long as it stays pretty tame, I'm all for it.
I want a Mord. I don't know why you all want Born. Who doesn't want a giant flying psychotic bear?
It's like one of those personality tests based on your favorite TV show. What kind of person are you? So I think we could design one out of your novels. That would be great.
Right. Or we could do the VanderMeer Zoo. That could be a cool project.
Gosh, part of it's up there, right behind me. The Born Zoo is right there.
Is it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. They're a little blurry, but I think I see some of them. So Joe or Richard, did you have final questions, or do you want to take one out of the chat, or what do you think?
Well, I was hoping Joe would ask his space exploration question.
I can do that.
Oh,
sure.
Yeah. Do it.
Well, no, it's funny. As I said, as I was getting ready for this, the last thing I read was Dead Astronauts, and then I was just thinking lately too, and partly too, it's Richard is co-teaching with someone who's spent many years working for NASA in the Sustainable Futures class, but also all of the kind of that moment when you think, oh my God, people can get so excited because something landed on Mars and we get these images. And I share that excitement too, but it also feels a little complex, right? And it comes back to those questions about how we imagine futures, how much space exploration is this thing we'd love to believe is a kind of pure human impulse, and how much it is about things that you've talked about, like extraction, like whose land is this, like what are we doing exactly, imagining other places. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out as something for you to reflect on.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all these ironies. First of all, and many people have started saying this, I'm glad to see it, is just this whole idea of of this unthinking idea that we have the right to basically conquer other places, to colonize other places. And that's deeply problematic, especially in the context of, the horror show in my head is, we go to a planet eventually that actually has a fairly diverse ecosystem. And just like on Earth, we can't recognize where the intelligence is. We wind up eating all of the intelligent species. I'm just saying, it sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's actually a deeply problematic thing to think, because you're really talking about conquest. The idea that a planet that's out there, an exoplanet, is just waiting for us to take up residence and build suburbs is patently ridiculous. But the other thing is that's ridiculous and absurd, and it doesn't take away from what I love about NASA, which is the things we learn along the way and the actual exploration that's not exploitive, is I can't get over the fact that Elon Musk has built a rocket site on an environmentally sensitive part of the Texas coast, flaunting FAA and EPA regulations, and now wants to mine for natural gas on it to support his rockets. I mean, how do we not see the inherent irony and just awfulness of that? How do we escape that when we're trying to put together this future that seems so hopeful? And it's so unnecessary. It's not necessary. None of that had to happen. And yet it happened. And that's the thing I find both horrifying and fascinating. That's the difference. That's what I want to explore, even though that's not really what you want to note it, but that's not what you want to speculate about or go in where you're going. But that's what fascinates me, is like, what is the impulse that also leads millions of people on Twitter to follow that unquestioningly And if I post a comment in the stream, which I do because I'm a fool, I suddenly get beaten up by 5 billion people who say, I don't know what I'm talking about. It's total propaganda. There's no wildlife there. He's not doing any of this stuff.
Well, as we said earlier, we're hoping for the return of Twitter and tweeting to its sort of more natural species-oriented life. So maybe this will be more welcome in some other future.
Precisely. Well, everyone, we're at 7.
Did we lose?
We may have lost Simony, so I think she was saying, oh, you're there, Simony.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was saying it's 7 o'clock, and I'm happy to keep on chatting for sure. What should we do?
Maybe we should take
a few more questions if you want to. It's not totally up to you. I'm not sure we should end with that last one. So
one or two more.
I mean, also, you know.
I know. Well, I love that. I love the story of the Muskian, like settler colonial subject extraordinaire. I mean, it doesn't get much more settler colonial than that, right?
Yeah.
Let me mine gas for my rocket and destroy a bunch of creatures as I go around.
As I go to Mars
for that resource.
I mean, I'm laughing not because it's funny, you know. It's like, you know, it's just, you could laugh or you cry about it. I don't know.
It's like the absurd. It's like the absurd that you were mentioning before.
Yes, exactly.
It's like, you know, you have to be able to laugh at it in some ways, and it's what gets us through it, and somehow. I can take a Joe. Do you have a question, or shall I take one here?
I was just going to say, well, I'll do one quick maybe, and then you. And I was really curious. So there's a great question in the Q&A from Konstantin, and I'll read it, and then I'll sort of post it forward so everyone can see it. Hearing you read from and talk about the new book, which seems to revolve around 2 strong female characters, I'm curious to hear you talk a bit more about the ways this book brings together or doesn't, the environmental imaginaries of your previous work and the feminist project of things like Sisters of the Revolution, which you co-edited with VanderMeer. It's a nice question. Thanks, Konstantin.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You know, I just, I don't know. I think that I've been very fortunate to be able to write characters who are not men that readers have responded to, you know, I mean, and I don't know really how to talk about that. I think it's presumptuous to really kind of talk about it, except to say that I try to inhabit very deeply every character that I write. And I have been writing mostly women characters. And I think I have a lot of trouble with a typical white male point of view these days. And I just don't want to, it doesn't interest me. It doesn't, I don't know. It doesn't, it's difficult to talk about too, because sometimes it just comes to me. But on the other hand, you know, people coming up to me, women coming up to me, you know, during the Annihilation tour and saying that they really appreciated this atypical character probably did prime my subconscious to write more like that. What was the first part of the question?
So just the last part was just how it also connects to your work with VanderMeer, right? This sort of Sisters of the Revolution.
Well, I mean, that's another thing is that Anne's, you know, it's not a co-author kind of situation, but it is a kind of tactically in that way, which is to say I'll write a book, and along the way, there's probably a dozen scenes that before I wrote them and during writing them, Anne and I will have a long conversation about. And often that's about the gender dynamics, sometimes family dynamics, because she comes from a large extended family and I come from like a subnuclear family. So it's very hard for me to even imagine what a second cousin looks like. And so over time, I have kind of internalized that, but it's very important for me to talk this stuff out. And you know, I think it goes back to a book called Finch, where I was using noir tropes, and I had the girlfriend of the main detective kind of like deliberately inhabiting those tropes because she's kind of a spy, but then also I felt like she wasn't breaking free of them. And so I think that was maybe the pivotal moment for that part of the question, which is that I knew I had written a character that I, for whatever reason, because I had a male perspective, I couldn't see that character properly. I wasn't seeing them. And so Anne helped a lot with that. So there's that. And then there's the fact that when we collaborate on anthologies, that's all source material in a way for my subconscious going forward with the books, because you read so much so quickly that it becomes this kind of substrate or level in your brain of sedimentary material that gets processed very quickly and then can kind of come out in the fiction without even realizing it. So.
Jeff, there's a question from Rigoberto Quintana that asks, you mentioned in one of these past responses that the past speaks to the future. And so Rigo wanted to ask how silences fit into the future. And as an example, in Born, Rachel makes mention of her memories that she didn't want to share with the reader. She explicitly says, like, there's things I'm not going to tell you that were in the letter from Wick.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you decide what to leave out in your writing, and how does that affect characters' futures, even though it might not have been expressed? It's sort of a subjunctive future somehow.
I think it's a really powerful way to deal with things, in a sense, because it gives a sense of agency to the character that I think makes the character very real. There's a similar kind of thing in Hummingbird Salamander, where the book starts out seemingly in second person because Jane is trying to put you in her shoes. And then I go back to that every once in a while. There's little snippets where she's saying, imagine if you were, and goes into it. And there's things where there's parts of that where I would do a list of imagine you are this or that or the other. And then I would cut out some of those lines as things that Jane wouldn't want to share. And so there were definitely scenes that were written into the draft that don't exist anymore, but I feel like their presence is still there. And I don't know how to describe that. It's because they affect the other scenes. And I don't mean like there's suddenly missing information, but there's definitely this sense that something is being withheld, and you don't know what it is, but it's not, I think, puzzling because you have all you need for the plot. But it does tell you that Jane is kind of not manipulating, but she's definitely, again, like you said, not telling everything. But the answer to your question is it is a powerful way of dealing with it. I do think that if you don't deal with the past, that it keeps coming back. And that's one of the hugest problems we have in this country today, and in a lot of countries, and in a lot of ways is a very human problem. Yeah. Sorry, I'm beginning to lose the thread just a tad here.
That's great. Thank you. Richard?
Well, I love that we concluded a conversation about speculative futures by tying it to the past, which was really wonderful. I also have to say, I wrote down the phrase, I bought into systems that despised me, from Hummingbird Salamander. What a great thing to put in an I quit letter if it ever comes to that, right? Well, okay, so before everyone leaves, I want to encourage you to register for our next Planet Now session. It's entitled The Futures of Electricity. It's going to be on Monday, April the 5th at 6 p.m. Central Time. And our guests will include Akhil Gupta, who's a professor of anthropology at UCLA, and Leah Stokes, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and affiliated with the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and the Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Barbara. So given what we have experienced in Texas recently with electricity, that should be quite an event to tune into. It'll be hosted by Professor Dominic Boyer, anthropology from Rice. I will be acting as a co-moderator. Then April 14th, Cultures of Media and Environmental Health. So if I can get Sean to put the link to where to find details for registration in the chat, that would be wonderful. I want to thank my co-moderators, Simony Howe and Joseph Campana, and of course, our fabulous guest speaker, Jeff VanderMeer. Jeff, it has been a complete honor to have been in conversation with you. We really appreciate your being so willing to not only join us, but to share a brand new work. So, we feel like the first night of a tour, getting to hear the new songs. So this is great. And of course, we look forward to the moment where we can see you in person and have a book signing and take you out on Houston's amazing dining scene, and maybe even spark some ideas about what the next work will look like. But until then, we'll settle for virtual, and the joy of knowing that we've brought together so many people with such a small carbon footprint related to the event. So there's that. So finally, for our audience, thank you so much for tuning in to Planet Now. We appreciate that you chose to spend an hour and 10 minutes of your time with us. We hope you've concluded that it was time well spent. We look forward to seeing you again on April the 5th. So once again, thank you, everyone, from Rice University in Houston. Good night, everyone.